Everyone, did you know that during the reigns of Empress Dowager Liu or Wu Zetian, women often remembered as the most ruthless in Chinese history, the common people actually lived through some of the most peaceful and prosperous times? Why did great historians like Sima Qian record the politics of these women, who rose through such bloody power struggles, as reigns of sage-like rulers? Today, we seek to unravel that ironic secret.
The era of Empress Dowager Liu, Empress Gao, in the former Han Dynasty, is the first instance in Chinese history where a woman reigned as the de facto ruler of the empire. This period simultaneously holds two faces: brutal power struggles and the stabilization of the people's livelihoods.
Liu Zhi, the wife of the founding hero Liu Bang, did not start her journey as a glamorous empress. While her husband traversed battlefields during the uprising, she stayed behind to serve her in-laws and till the barren land. During the fires of the Chu-Han contention, she was captured by Shang Yu and crossed the threshold of death for over 2 years as a prisoner. The only reason she endured on the cold prison floor was her faith in her husband. However, upon returning after crossing the line between life and death, she was met not with warm comfort, but with the laughter of the young and clever concubine, Lady Qi. Amidst her husband's betrayal and cold alienation, she realized a cold truth: love changes, but power guarantees survival.
The crisis did not end there. Liu Bang attempted to appoint Lady Qi's son, Ru Yi, as the crown prince, threatening the future of Liu Ji's only pride, her son, Emperor Hui. Pushed to the edge of a cliff, Liu Ji knelt and endured humiliation to pull off a political masterstroke, recruiting the 4 Hows of Mount Shang, the greatest recluses of the era. When Liu Bang saw the white-haired sages guarding the prince at a banquet, he remarked, "The prince's wings have already grown," and gave up on the replacement. Through this victory, Liu confirmed her strength within the court and rose as a de facto ruler that even Liu Bang could no longer easily touch.
In 1950 BC, upon the death of the founder Liu Bang, Liu Ji's long-suppressed madness erupted. She first committed the horrific human swine incident, mutilating Lady Qi, who had threatened her son's position, and throwing her into a latrine. When her own son, Emperor Hui, abandoned state affairs out of shock at the cruelty, Empress Dowager Liu seized the imperial seal as if she had been waiting. Mocking the final decree that none but the Liu clan may be kings, she appointed her own family members as kings and filled key positions with the Liu clan. Now the empire was no longer the land of the Liu. It became a massive machine driven by the will of Empress Dowager Liu alone. Once at the pinnacle of power, Empress Dowager Liu made an unexpected choice. She sensed that what the people needed, exhausted by the harsh legalism of the Qin dynasty and the fires of war, was not grand achievements, but rest from doing nothing. She first abolished the law against possessing books, a harsh law from the Qin era that forbade commoners from owning books, and significantly eased the system of collective punishment that wiped out 3 generations of a family. Unlike the bloody atmosphere of the court, songs began to echo again in the rural fields. She brought the Taoist philosophy of ruling by not ruling to the forefront to heal the empire's wounds. In 192 BC, Modu Chanyu, the strong leader of the northern Xiongnu, sent a mocking letter to Empress Dowager Liu. It was a shocking insult, saying, "I am alone and you are a widow, so I wish to stay with you." Based on her personality, she might have sent an army immediately, but she swallowed her anger. Her polite reply, stating she was too old and frail to serve, so I send beauties and tribute instead, was not cowardice, but thorough pragmatism. Instead of paying the massive cost of war, she chose to lay down the empire's pride so that the people could focus on their livelihoods instead of going to the front lines. The 15-year reign of Empress Dowager Liu left record-breaking achievements. Taxes were lowered, granaries overflowed with grain, and punishments were reduced. In his Records of the Grand Historian, Sima Qian highly praised her era, saying, "Punishments were seldom used, so criminals were few, and the people devoted themselves to farming so that food and clothing were abundant." Although the Liu clan collapsed after her death, the economic wealth and stable system she cultivated became the sturdy roots that made the rule of Wen and Jing, the absolute peak of the Han dynasty, possible. The woman called the Witch of the Palace paradoxically left behind a legacy of governance akin to a warm mother of the earth for her people. The era of Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to ascend to the throne as emperor, was a time of revolution that completely overturned existing customs and designed a new national system. In 649, when Emperor Taizong Li Shimin of the Tang dynasty passed away, the life of his concubine Wu Zhao, Wu Tietian, seemed to have reached its end. According to the customs of the time, childless concubines had to shave their heads and enter a temple called Ganye Temple to spend their lives praying for the late emperor. With her dark hair cut and wearing coarse monastic robes, she was destined to grow old in a cold hermitage. However, the spark of forbidden love she had shared with Taizong's son, Li Ji, the future Emperor Gaozong, was still alive in her heart. On the anniversary of Taizong's death, the new Emperor Gaozong visited Ganye Temple and found Wu Zhao standing there in tears. Gaozong could not forget the woman who had belonged to his father, and Wu Zhao did not miss this opportunity. At the time, Gaozong's primary consort, Empress Wang, decided to use Wu Zhao to keep her rival, Consort Xiao, in check, and made the radical choice to bring her back to the palace. It was like bringing in a tiger to catch a wolf. In 651, Wu Zhao took off her nun's robes and made a glamorous return as Consort Xiao Yi, a second-rank concubine of the Tang Palace. Upon returning to the palace, Wu Zhao was no longer the fragile woman of the past. She devised a meticulous plan to simultaneously bring down Empress Wang and Consort Xiao. It is here that one of the most controversial events in Chinese history occurs. Records state that Wu Zhao strangled her own newborn daughter and framed Empress Wang for the crime. A furious Gaozong deposed Empress Wang and imprisoned her with Consort Xiao. Later, Wu Zhao inflicted a brutal revenge by cutting off their limbs and putting them in wine jars to die, finally ascending to the position of Empress, the mother of the empire.
An opportunity came to Wu Zetian after she became empress. When her husband Gaozong suffered from a chronic wind disorder involving severe headaches and dizziness, making it difficult to handle state affairs, she began to make decisions on his behalf. Gradually, her voice grew louder than the emperor's. This was the prelude to power moving from the emperor's bedroom to the empress's fingertips. She raised a new force to check senior ministers, the scholars of the North Gate. Through them, she poured out new policies, not bound by Confucian traditions. People began to call Gaozong and Wu Zhao the two sages, effectively recognizing her governance.
Even after Gaozong died, Wu Zhao had no intention of letting go of power. Her first son met a suspicious death. Her second son was deposed and committed suicide, and she deposed her third son just a month after his enthronement. Having viewed even her own flesh and blood as tools of power, she finally abandoned the title of Tang in 690 and proclaimed her own dynasty, Zhou. It was the birth of the first and only female emperor in Chinese history, the Holy and Divine Emperor. Breaking a taboo that had lasted for thousands of years, she stepped out from behind the curtain and finally revealed herself under the sun. The crowned emperor Wu Zetian first began to tear down the thick wall of lineage. To check aristocratic families, she drastically reorganized the Guogyou civil service examination system. She introduced the palace examination, where the emperor personally interviewed and selected talent, opening a path where even those from humble backgrounds could become core officials based on skill. These talents became the foundation for the prosperity known as the rule of Wuzhou. Her governance was dual-sided. On one hand, she operated a reign of terror through a secret police system to purge enemies. On the other, she poured her heart into the people's welfare. She distributed agricultural technology,
levied taxes fairly, and raised the status of women by equalizing the mourning period for mothers and fathers. During her reign, the population surged and the economy met an unprecedented boom. While the palace was cold with snitching and purges, the empire's fields were filled with golden grain. In her old age, she returned the throne to her son and ended her life as an empress. A massive monument was erected in front of her tomb, the Chanling Mausoleum, but not a single word was inscribed upon it. This is called the wordless stele. Let future historians judge my merits and faults. It was the defiant declaration of a woman who stood at the peak of history. The foundation she laid allowed her grandson Xuanzang to lead the Tang dynasty to its ultimate peak. Among the female leaders in Chinese history, Xiao Chao, Empress Dowager Chen Tian of the Liao, Khitan, represents the most dynamic and powerful warrior queen. She led the golden age of the Khitan people with dramatic strategy and military talent. In the autumn of 982, Emperor Jingzong of the Liao dynasty suddenly passed away at a hunting ground. The empire was thrown into shock, and left behind were only the 12-year-old crown prince Yelu Longshu, Emperor Shangzong, and his mother, Xiao Chao. For the nomadic Khitan people, a strong leader was a condition for survival. An underaged emperor meant the perfect opportunity for ambitious men lurking everywhere to usurp the throne. Outside the palace, members of the imperial family began moving their troops, and the ministers in the court were busy scanning the room to see which side they should stand on. Xiao Chao did not even have the luxury to be immersed in grief. She first summoned Yelu Sajen and Han Deyong, who were the core of military power and her most trusted confidants. Then, at a gathering of ministers, she showed the tears of a mother instead of the flashy authority of an empress dowager. My husband has passed away early, my son is young, and the kinsmen are powerful. On whom should I now rely? This exquisite appeal stimulated the minister's protective instincts and loyalty. However, behind those tears, she was already making cold-blooded decisions, controlling the entry of opposing imperial kinsmen and declaring martial law over the entire capital.
She was not a woman who simply gave orders from within the castle walls. Following Khitan tradition, she personally rode on horseback to inspect the troops and boost the morale of the soldiers. By appearing on the battlefield holding her young son's hand, she personally proved that my son is the future of the Khitan. She cut the buds of power by sending the imperial kinsmen who threatened her to remote border regions or stripping them of their official ranks. Having suppressed the crisis of a bloody civil war in just a few months, Xiao Chao was reborn from a grieving widow into Empress Dowager Cheng Tian, holding the fate of the empire in her hands. Her gaze now began to move beyond the chaotic interior toward the Song dynasty, the massive empire to the south that was constantly looking for a chance to march north. Just as she had protected her young son and pacified the interior, a massive dark cloud approached Empress Dowager Cheng Tian. Emperor Taizong of the southern Song dynasty, taking advantage of the Liao's perceived chaos, marched north with a grand army to reclaim the lost land, the 16 prefectures of Yanyun. However, the Song dynasty miscalculated. The enemy they had to face was not a fragile widow, but a strong woman who personally mounted a horse to lead her army. In 986, Empress Dowager Cheng Tian went directly to the front lines, captured the Song's famous general Yang Ye, and won a great victory, cruelly crushing the Song dynasty's ambitions to march north. She did not stop at defense. In the autumn of 1004, Empress Dowager Cheng Tian began a southward march toward the heart of the Song dynasty, with her now adult son, Emperor Shangzong, leading 200,000 Khitan cavalrymen. Her army was unstoppable. They broke through the Song's defensive lines one by one and advanced to Chanyun, only about 100 li away from the capital, Kaifeng. The Song court was seized with terror, and Emperor Zhangzong was put in a position where he had to personally come to the front lines to beg for peace. The handle of the sword was now perfectly held by Empress Dowager Cheng Tian.
As a fox on the battlefield, she was also seasoned at the diplomatic table.
Instead of completely destroying the Song dynasty, she chose the pragmatism of securing long-term profits. This is the historic Treaty of Chanyuan. The Song Emperor and the Liao Emperor entered into a brotherhood, where the Song took the face-saving honor of being the elder brother, while the Liao took the practical benefit of receiving 100,000 taels of silver and 200,000 bolts of silk as annual tribute. With this treaty, which fed the Khitan people without shedding another drop of blood, the Liao dynasty met its greatest period of prosperity since its founding.
Having led the war against the Song to victory and seized massive wealth, Empress Dowager Chengtian now turned her eyes inward. This was because the task remained to rule both the rough nomadic Khitan people and the Han Chinese with their sophisticated civilization within one fence. While respecting traditional Khitan customs, she completed a dual administration system by boldly introducing the advanced administrative systems of the Han. By applying their own ways to nomads and their own laws to settlers, she suppressed conflicts within the empire and prepared the foundation for true peace. She was not a ruler who suppressed simply through force. Empress Dowager Chengtian reorganized the criminal law, the Liao's first systematic legal code, to ensure that anyone who committed a crime was punished regardless of status and that there was no injustice. She also encouraged agriculture and practiced people-first politics by immediately granting tax exemptions in the event of drought or flood. Under her reign, the Liao was no longer a tribal alliance subsisting on plunder, but stood tall as a de facto hegemon of East Asia with solid economic and administrative power. In 1009, she handed over all authority to her son, Emperor Shengzong, who had grown into a wise ruler. Unlike other previous empresses who deposed or killed their sons out of a blind lust for power, she strictly maintained her position as a supporter and chose a quiet retirement. When she passed away just a few months after her retirement, the Liao was enjoying the greatest prosperity since its founding. Emperor Shengzong carried on his mother's legacy to let the golden age of the Liao blossom, and Empress Dowager Chengtian was eternally recorded as the wisest and strongest mother of the empire in Khitan history.
The era of Empress Dowager Cixi, who clutched the final strings of power in the Qing dynasty and watched over the empire's twilight, was a period where glamorous luxury and miserable collapse coexisted. In 1852, Lan'er, Cixi, the 17-year-old daughter of an ordinary Manchu official, entered the Forbidden City after passing the imperial selection process. However, among the numerous concubines, she was merely a noble lady who received little attention. Instead of despairing, she created an opportunity. Every day at dusk, she sang sorrowful and beautiful songs in the garden along the path where the Xianfeng emperor took his walks. Eventually, she succeeded in gaining the emperor's favor, drawn by the sound of her singing. In 1856, she gave birth to his only flesh and blood, a son, the Tongji emperor, and was elevated to noble consort Yi, the mistress of the empire. Her song was not a simple melody, but a prelude to power. In 1860, as the British and French allied forces pressured Beijing during the Second Opium War, the Xianfeng emperor fled to the Chengde mountain resort with Cixi and their son. However, the sickly emperor passed away there at the age of 31. Before his death, he left a will for 8 ministers to assist his young son, but this was a massive threat to Cixi. If the ministers monopolized power, she could not even guarantee her own life or her son's. Cixi cast aside her grief and began preparing a grand gamble, secretly contacting the emperor's younger brother, Prince Gong, who remained in Beijing. In 1861, while returning to Beijing transporting her husband's coffin, Cixi executed a lightning-fast coup. This was the Xinyu coup. Using Prince Gong's military strength, she instantly arrested the 8 ministers who had checked her, causing them to be executed or forced into suicide.
Upon arriving in Beijing, she declared looking over politics from behind a screen alongside the primary consort, Empress Dowager Xian, for the young Tongji Emperor. A 27-year-old young woman sitting behind a curtain, Cixi. The fate of the collapsing giant empire, the Qing, was now held in her hands. Now, no one could mock her as the singing concubine anymore. When her biological son, the Tongji Emperor, passed away at the young age of 20 without an heir, the Forbidden City was thrown into a stir once again. Cixi faced a crisis where she might have to relinquish power, but she made a clever move. She installed her nephew, the son of her younger brother-in-law, who was only 4 years old, the Guangxu Emperor, on the throne. Fearing a power vacuum more than the death of her son, she sat behind the curtain once more as Grand Empress Dowager and held the reins of the empire. To the Guangxu Emperor, Cixi was a mother and a teacher, but at the same time, she was like a massive prison. As time passed and the Guangxu Emperor became a young man, he grew furious at the reality of his motherland being trampled by Western powers. In 1898, he partnered with reformist intellectuals like Kang Youwei to proclaim the 100 Days Reform, a grand national reform modeled after Japan's Meiji Restoration. This 100-day reform, aimed at abolishing old customs and moving toward a constitutional monarchy, met with fierce backlash from conservative forces, including Cixi. To Cixi, this reform was not a simple policy change, but a rebellion that shook her authority and the vested interests of the Manchu aristocracies to their core. Upon receiving intelligence that the Guangxu Emperor intended to remove her, Cixi moved like lightning. She recruited the military strongman Yuan Shikai to march his troops into the Forbidden City. Reformist figures were executed or driven into exile, and the Guangxu Emperor was imprisoned in Yingtai, a small island in the middle of a lake within the Summer Palace. The emperor was alive, but no different from the dead, and Cixi stepped to the forefront once again to monopolize power under the pretext of Hanzhong, teaching politics. The last golden time for the empire to be reborn as a modern state cooled away in Cixi's hands.
While the national treasury was emptying and foreign invasions grew more intense, Cixi's eyes were fixed only on a glamorous palace to flaunt her authority. She diverted massive naval funds that had been earmarked for the modernization of the Qing Navy to extensively renovate the Summer Palace, Yi Huinan, as a place for her 60th birthday celebration and a resort. The Qing'an, a massive marble boat floating on the lake, was the ultimate symbol of her extravagance. But just as that boat was fixed to the lake and could not move, the defense power of the Qing also came to a standstill under Cixi's desires. The defeat in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 was the horrific price brought about by that luxurious choice.
In 1900, when the Boxers, a civilian force resisting Western invasion, rose up, Cixi made a reckless gamble to use them to drive out the Western powers. However, the result was disastrous. As the Eight-Nation Alliance occupied Beijing and pillaged the Forbidden City, the mistress of the empire changed into the clothes of a commoner and set out on a miserable path of flight to Xi'an. When she finally returned to Beijing after countless hardships, what greeted her were a palace in ruins and humiliating unequal treaties. She invited Western envoys to banquets and late-stage appeasement policies, but the pillars of the empire were already rotten to the core. In November 1908, the imprisoned Guangxu Emperor met a mysterious death at the age of 38, and on the very next day, Cixi, who had commanded the empire for half a century, also closed her eyes at the age of 74. Right before she drew her last breath, she designated the 3-year-old child Puyi as the next emperor, never letting go of the cord of power until the moment she died. She left a paradoxical final testament: never let a woman involve herself in politics again. After her funeral procession, decorated with brilliant jewels and silk, passed by, the Manchu Qing dynasty, which had lasted for over 260 years, disappeared into history's end amidst the fires of the Xinhai Revolution only 3 years later.
Was the era of the empresses good? The answer to this question can be evaluated as, while there were problems with the ruthlessness in the process of seizing power, the stability and prosperity of the empire that appeared as a result were in many ways superior to the eras led by men. Paradoxically, the periods ruled by empresses were generally golden ages when the lives of the people were abundant.
Rather than obsessing over a territorial expansion or wars of ideology that male emperors often fell into, they showed a practical attitude of strengthening internal affairs and revitalizing the economy. The eras of Empress Dowager Lu and Wu Zetian reduced harsh taxes and encouraged agriculture, laying the economic foundation that allowed later male emperors to enjoy their peak prosperity. Empress Dowager Tang Tian also secured the empire's practical interests through a diplomatic victory known as the Treaty of Chanyuan, rather than reckless conquest. However, a tragedy exists in that to rise to the top as a woman, they had to be several times more ruthless than men. In a Confucian order, a female ruler was considered abnormal. Therefore, to silence the opposition, they had to use extreme reigns of terror as a means, such as Empress Dowager Lu's human swine incident or Wu Zetian's politics of snitching. Because they tried to protect their power by bringing in families with different surnames, their maternal families, the side effect of national chaos recurring after their deaths as the maternal relatives collapsed was repeated. Like Wu Zetian, breaking down the aristocratic politics centered on lineage and establishing a merit-based system called guago, civil service exams, was a great innovation that even male emperors could not easily achieve. On the other hand, Cixi failed to read the changing world situation and accelerated the empire's collapse by trying only to protect her own authority. This was not a matter of gender, but a typical problem that occurs when an entrenched power refuses the flow of the times. In conclusion, the era of the empresses was tragic in its political process, but brilliant in its governance results. Because they had to maintain power while breaking through the strong resistance of the male ruling class, ruthlessness in the process was unavoidable. However, the internal affairs and stabilization of the people's lives based on that power were actually superior to many male emperors who were obsessed with war and prestige.